way it was the founders envisioned it and tried to shape it. It is almost impossible to answer whether this portrait is fulfilled or not, and of course we will discuss the Declaration's legacy. But first we would like to discuss how the Declaration was decided upon, who shaped it, and what were the struggles and debates along the way. For that, I'm glad to introduce Dr. Neil Rogachevsky from Yeshiva University and Mr. Dov Zigler, co-authors of Israel's Declaration of Independence, the history and political theory of the nation's founding moment. So, welcome to BJ, and thank you for joining us today.
Thank you for hosting us, Kobi.
Delighted to be here.
And my first question will be to you, Dov. I mean, Neil, you're a professor. Dov, you're a financier. You're a finance guy. What's to you and Israel's Declaration of Independence?
Well, it's a fantastic question. Again, thank you for hosting us. It's a pleasure to be at BJ, a fantastic institution, and one where we know people have a lot of interest in the subject of the Declaration of Independence of Israel, something that Professor Rogachevsky and I are both passionate and excited to discuss with you here today. So why, I'll answer the question a little bit differently. Why the Declaration of Independence at all? I think that I, just like so many other people who are interested in Israel, its legacy, its meaning, just had this magnetic draw to the question of the Declaration of Independence, what its meaning is, where it comes from. And the extraordinary thing that happened in the early 2000s is that for the first time ever, as the protocols of Minhalat Ha'am and other vital institutions became declassified and as scholars began to pour through the archival material, suddenly a whole different picture of how Israel's Declaration of Independence came to be, how it was written, what the political pressures were at the time and what the debates were, came into light that shed an entirely richer context, that offered an entirely richer context about Israel's founding document. And so as the documents became available to the public, I, as a young graduate student and scholar, became quite interested, as did my dear friend and colleague, Professor Rogachevsky.
Cool, thank you. So, the book is divided into 4 sections. Please elaborate on the structure. I mean, why did you choose what you chose?
Sure, Neil, do you want to get started?
It's very interesting, right? When do you, picking a starting point is always a very difficult question in a book, right? Because 10 people will come to you afterwards and say, what about, there's an incredible precursor which you've glossed over, or you've neglected, and so on. So so it's divided at 4, we have 4 sections: 1, background, 2nd, political theory, 3rd, history, 4th, legacy. And I think this together gives us a comprehensive portrait of both the history of the composition of the text and the political, diplomatic, momentous decisions which were made in the stormiest days, one could argue, in modern Jewish times, right? Amidst, this is all going on April, May 1948, amidst the War of Independence had already begun and it was about to enter its decisive phase. So we narrate the dramatic series of choices that were facing the leaders of the Yishuv, the pre-state settlement in Palestine, and also the question of ideas. How did they grapple with the questions, as Dov was mentioning, but of a founding? What does it mean to found a state? What kind of ideas are we going to employ as we try to shape not only the fact of having a state, which was obviously first question. We need to succeed. We need to win the battle. We need to guarantee our presence here. But also then addressing the kind of state we're going to have. What's going to be our relationship to rights? How are we going to think of the question of religion and state together? What's going to be our doctrine of state sovereignty? How are we going to relate to the world powers? How are we going to relate to minorities? So we try to do, which is, I think it worked well. You can check out the book. We sort of crisscross, traditionally what might be called history and also what we call political theory. And then a final section in this, we got lucky, whether it's good for Israel in general, this is another question. We trace a legacy of the Declaration of Independence through subsequent Israeli history up until the day before yesterday. And of course, it's become a extremely contentious, I would say a beautiful and actually moderating, calming force in the current controversies in Israel. So we try to cover all of that ground.
And so maybe to pick up where Professor Rogachevsky just began our story, the book's 4 parts try to walk the reader through how the Declaration of Independence of Israel was written and what the main ideas of the Declaration of Independence are. And so we began by tracing the background to the Declaration of Independence, which is an extraordinary conference that happened roughly a month before independence in Israel was declared. It was called the Vad HaPoel HaTzioni. It was one of the oldest organizations in Zionism, founded by Theodor Herzl. And its aim was to basically be the executive of Zionists all around the world. And David Ben-Gurion gathers all these people together in order to wrest control of all of the different NGOs that existed in the Zionist world, so that he could then bring together, for the first time ever in the Yishuv, a unified council that had authority over all parts of Zionism. And these 13 people who he put on this council included future prime ministers Moshe Sharet, Golda Meir, others. She was an honorary member, but a decisive one who probably was the most prominent speaker after Ben-Gurion in their deliberations. And so that's what the background chapter is about. It's about this amazing debate where Ben-Gurion faces off against vested interests in NGOs, people on his far left, people on his far right, and says that rather than focusing on ideological differences right now, we need to vest authority for the Yishuv in the hands of a few of us who can make the consequential decisions towards independence. So that's sort of the first part. Neil, do you want to explain what the second part is, the political theory part?
Yeah, so once this move was really decisive, that happened in that April, the founding of the government. Then we go on and discuss the drafting process of the Declaration of Independence. And this is an extraordinary story. We tell some stories which we hope will become more prominent in the Jewish world, beginning in a Passover day in Tel Aviv. The first draft of the Israeli Declaration of Independence, which was a verbatim translation of the American Declaration of Independence translated into Hebrew. It was written by a young lawyer in Tel Aviv, 33-year-old Mordechai Beham, along with an American rabbi, Harry Davidowitz, a fascinating character about whom much more ought to be known. And together, working in this elder rabbis he had immigrated to Palestine in the 1930s. He had this extensive library collection of the greats of political thought, of Shakespeare and so on. They sat down and they crafted they crafted source material upon which to construct a new Declaration of Independence. And that source material was principally the American Declaration of Independence, but also some other sources in Anglo-American political thought. So this was this remarkable attempt that this young lawyer and this very idiosyncratic, philosophic, theologically interesting rabbi had to try to create a founding statement for the Jewish state, which would in many ways draw on the rights tradition of the Americans, while blending, as they also tried to do, Jewish content from the Bible, right? So they made a statement of, which finally actually is, as we'll narrate as we share the story goes on, is, comes back when David Ben-Gurion writes the final draft. So they tried to combine the liberalism of the American founding and with the Jewish story as seen through an invocation of the Bible. So that was a beautiful first start, and I think you'd share that this is, other than David Ben-Gurion's final draft, probably the most interesting draft, most theoretically rich draft in the drafting process of Israel's Declaration of Independence.
And there were a couple other political theory drafts too. Do we want to do those? No, I'll do the history part.
Should we do more? Yeah. Okay. So what happens next? So Baham writes this extraordinary draft, largely based on the American Declaration of Independence, and it's roundly rejected. He comes back to the office on a Monday after having worked on this Sunday or a Monday, after having worked on this on a weekend, and he gathers with some other young Turks, lawyers in what was called the legal department, the burgeoning, essentially the proto-justice ministry of the state to be, and basically its substance is edited out, and what happens over the course of subsequent weeks, the draft sort of evolves in a labor Zionist direction. The next significant draft was written by a fellow called Zvi Berenson, who would become a prominent judge, sat on the Supreme Court of Israel for many decades, and he wrote a draft of the Declaration of Independence which was remarkably different, which drew upon entirely different basis than had Baham and Davidowitz. He justified the state on the basis of labor Zionist doctrines, the right of the pioneers, and so forth. And that was basically the main tendency of the document until as it weaved through these bureaucratic offices through April, leading into May 1948, before it became a decisive issue for the leaders of this new council, which had been founded.
And so the next part of our
So I actually want to ask you, before we getting into the next part, I want to ask you about those drafts. So, Dov, you mentioned that you had a Vada Poel, as we can call it, the executive of the Zionist movement. And when Ben-Gurion wanted all the signatures on the declaration, he wanted it to be unanimous, right? He wanted it to be across the board. So, I don't know if I jumped too much ahead, but if that was something that you wanted to touch upon, how was he able to delegate between the different views with the Orthodox and the revisionist and the communist, that eventually he got a total of 37 signatures, right, of the whole spectrum of the Zionist movement at that time. What was behind the scene? What went behind the scenes?
Well, that's really one of the great elements of the Declaration of Independence. So there are two ways in which David Ben-Gurion sought to create a strong consensus for the Declaration of Independence. The first one, and this is one of the remarkable things that he does at that Vad HaPoel Tzioni conference, is he pulls together two councils. There's a narrow one, basically of his trusted colleagues and the people who wield the most political power in the Yishuv, and they're going to be making all the consequential decisions. Now, the average leader would just do that, but Ben-Gurion thought very differently. He understood that he had to have a much wider coalition that could then endorse any decisions that were taken by him and his political partners. And so he assembled a much larger organization, which he called, so you have, the first one is called Minhalat Ha'am, and the second one is called Mo'etzet Ha'am. So you have like the national executive, and in English it's translated as national council. I mean, the Hebrew is somewhat different in both cases, but it's fine. Those are the terms in the official English. And what he does with the second council, he insists be drawn from all the political parties that had been represented in the elections that the Yishuv periodically would have, and they had one a couple of years earlier to the Jewish National Council, which was the body under the British mandate that represented the Jews. And he insisted that all the parties be represented, and this was a pretty tough thing to demand because the partisanship was bitter, and indeed at that very meeting they were arguing about all sorts of things, and there were 3 different motions at the end regarding what they ought to do, whether or not they should. Predictably, the far right wanted to declare independence right away with total indifference to the British schedule and risk the ire of the United States and others. The far left were much more concerned with speaking negatively about the Americans and the British and condemning international capitalism and promising international spiritual unity among workers. And Ben-Gurion, he had his eyes on the prize. All he cared about was making these 2 councils that would delegate the authority to him and to a broad group of people from across the spectrum of Jewish life in the Yishuv to declare independence. So he had his mind very, very clearly set on having this broad representation that could endorse whatever the Council of 13 would come up with. But he did a second thing. The second thing, and this is the astounding thing about not just Ben-Gurion, but I'd say all subsequent Israeli political life, gets conducted through consensus. People don't realize this, but the political institutions of Israel even are fairly weak. The cabinet makes most decisions. The security cabinet makes most security decisions. Very seldom is there an individual who's empowered just to do things, and it was no different in this Council of 13. And as a result, you see Ben-Gurion debating vociferously with his allies within his own party from Mapai and with his opponents from Mapam, the party that was to the left of Mapai, the more left-wing Workers' Party. And they're debating things throughout the process of drafting the final couple of drafts of the Declaration of Independence. And actually his biggest rival is Moshe Sharet, who's someone who he picked to put onto the council and is the number 2 on the Mapai list. The big difference, and we talk about this in the third part of our book, which is called the history part, and this is the part that involves both two things. It involves us walking through the diplomatic situation of the Yishuv as it was preparing to declare independence, and then unearthing and narrating and sort of letting the protocols of the minutes, of these meetings of the Council of 13 speak for themselves. And so here you see Moshe Sharet advocating for a very careful and cautious diplomatic approach. He was the chief diplomat of the Yishuv, and so he's advocating for a very cautious diplomatic approach. But you see rabbis, for example, representing the Mizrahi movement, who are advocating for more mention of religious material in the Declaration of Independence. You see the Mapam guys arguing for the opposite, and all sorts of other vital issues being debated. The biggest one is even the borders of the state, where predictably you could see you had Sharet saying that the borders ought to adhere to the borders that UN Resolution 181 had dictated, and Ben-Gurion saying we're in the middle of a war, I have no idea how things are going to go, and we have to omit this so that we're not in violation of whatever it is that we declare right away. So it's a very, very interesting story about pluralism and debate, and that's one part of it. But the crowning part of it is Ben-Gurion's decisions, because the way that the drafting process went was that the drafts that Professor Rogachevsky articulated, the draft of Tzvi Berenson, is put on the table of this council, and as well another one by an international lawyer that Moshe Sharet brings with him from New York is also put onto their table. And Sharet gives a breathless back and forth and secret account of all the diplomatic maneuverings that he's been undertaking in New York, the things that are going well, the support that they think they might have from people in Congress, the things that are going poorly, opposition from the State Department, and the things that they don't know about. Where does President Truman really sit? What's he willing to endorse, and what will he tell the state's bureaucracy to do, and what's he cautious about? And he presents all of this to the Council of 13, including Ben-Gurion, and they debate what they're then going to declare. And so they debate the principal diplomatic issues. What can they say about their independence? Some people say that we have to declare total independence. Other people say we should just declare that we're following UN Resolution 181, which was the resolution that had advocated for and said there in fact would be a separate Jewish and they said, Arab, those were the terms they used in the resolution, state, and as well in independent Jerusalem administered by the United Nations. That was the original partition plan, which of course came to naught because a war broke out immediately after it was announced. And so we tell the story of the debate over these two drafts. Moshe Sharet is delegated to write one. He writes one, and Ben-Gurion is not happy with it. And so that's sort of the second part of the drama here, because the draft is repudiated by Ben-Gurion, by some of his allies, and finally they decide that a new group of 3 people, 4 including Sharet, who's busy doing other things, it turns out, are going to write the final draft of the Declaration of Independence, what we call the Declaration of Independence of Israel, this amazing document that comes together through their debates.
So, Neil, do you want to add some more? Or
well, maybe we should talk about what actually happened then. What was this declaration? So it's extraordinary, right? So May 13th, all of this is happening over a course of 3 days. Sharet comes back from Washington after having met George Marshall, the great war hero, says, be careful about unilateral independence, guys, you're on your own. So he comes back, they're debating this diplomatic situation. They're debating this draft that Sharet does, which is pretty cautious. and which Charette, through the conversation and debate with his colleagues, advocates for a Declaration of Independence, which is basically following the UN model, this UN Resolution 181, which had been mentioned, and which had been this, international diplomatic reed, which was thought to have at least, some relevance in diplomatic speech, even as it's, was no longer operative on the ground, even though its logic had been totally overrun by the war, which started, in December. So Ben-Gurion deals with this, and he, basically, as Dov mentions, basically he and some others eviscerate essentially Charette's draft, although keeping some parts of it, as we'll see, and sets about on the evening of May 13th, basically, as he calls it, to modestly edit the draft, as he says, but he basically decisively rewrites it. He shapes it in a fundamentally new direction, and he sets up what we're calling, or we've called in several talks already. I hate to repeat myself, but it's just true. The three principles, or the three-legged stool of the Declaration of Independence, i.e., a totally new doctrine of the nature of rights, the nature of religion and state, and third, the nature of sovereignty. And this is Ben-Gurion made totally unique and decisively important, and I think beautiful choices on those areas. So let me just go through them quickly. One, sovereignty. Start with the last one I mentioned. So he breaks from the UN process decisively. He says we'll recognize the principle which had been articulated in November 29, 1947, i.e. there ought to be an independent Jewish state, but we don't commit ourselves in writing or indeed to any of the specific articles of that resolution, because the resolution had been totally blown away by developments in the war. That doesn't mean we won't have peace negotiation. Doesn't mean we'll be open to tinkering of the borders. If depending on what happens over the course of the war. But we're not bound by this. Fighting was everywhere. Fighting was through all of British Palestine. The War of Independence wasn't confined to the territory which had been allotted to the Arab state or to the Jewish one in the resolution. So he, in a way, he downplays, he downgrades the status of UN Resolution 181 and declares independence on this unique phrase which he comes up with, by virtue of our natural and historic right. So those get to the issue of natural and historic right, this remarkable phrase. So the natural right refers to this doctrine of rights. His doctrine of rights, which in a way brings us back to what we had mentioned at the beginning, Davidowitz and the young lawyer Mordechai Baham, and Ben-Gurion in his declaration articulates a doctrine that rights are inherent. They belong to the people. In fact, it must be said that text had been borrowed. The paragraph which Israel's Supreme Court has subsequently called the vision and credo of the state, that actually had been in there. Basically since the early drafts of the text. But he does one major thing. He changes one small word. He says the previous draft had said the state will grant rights to citizens, and he changed it, the state will guarantee rights or instantiate rights, i.e. rights belong to the people. So rights, these political and social rights that are listed in a Declaration of Independence, all the liberal rights we think of are associated with a liberal state, they belong to the people. So the declaration that Ben-Gurion signs off on, in which everyone across the Yishuv accepts, again, this consensus position expresses a view of the rights of citizens, right? That's point two. Point three is this question of what's called historic right, but it was not actually history. This is the Declaration's teaching on the nature of religion. And this is in the remarkable first paragraph of the Declaration. I'll just read it in English, might as well. You remember it off by heart at this second? I don't actually talked about it. Eretz Yisrael was the birthplace of the Jewish people. Here their spiritual, religious, and political identity was shaped. Here they first attained to statehood, created cultural values of natural and universal significance, and gave to the world the eternal book of books. That's the English translation. So this was written by Ben-Gurion himself in the small hours sometime between May 13th and May 14th. And it's really a remarkable statement, right? Because it implies that the state is not simply another nation state, right? Yes, nation states have a right to be, as he articulated in the other part of his teaching, right? We're a sovereign state. We have a right to this. We're going to be fully sovereign, et cetera. But he says that can't be enough. Somehow, the sort of the ideas, the world of Judaism, the principles of the world of Judaism, which he says derives from the Book of Books, the Bible, are going to find a home in the state. They're not going to control the state. This is not going to be theocracy. No one wanted that. Even though the Orthodox rabbis on the council weren't calling. No one was calling for theocracy. It's absurd on its face. But somehow these principles were going to find a certain kind of home in the state. Now, what the relationship, how this was to work is unclear, but it was kind of a beautiful statement, and he goes in this narrow lane between, you could say, saying, this will be a halachic state, a state of Jewish law, or on the other hand, as these previous labor Zionist drafts you mentioned had absolutely no invocation of the religion of Israel at all. And that was kind of a remarkable position to be in the few days before independence, have drafted a Declaration of Independence for a Jewish state, and they simply began with, by virtue of a traditional or historic and traditional connection to the land, saying nothing about what's the nature of that traditional connection. So Ben-Gurion tried in this first paragraph, and I think did a beautiful job. It perhaps is not complete. Perhaps one needs to continue thinking about what that might mean. But it's a beautiful, altogether, these three principles, I think, help orient us as we try to think about the purposes of the Jewish state, even today.
And it's important to add that actually two of them were entirely novel. So in the long process of writing the Declaration of Independence, the part that speaks about the list of different types of substantive rights that the citizens will have, the part that comes after the middle of the Declaration of Independence, where the text speaks about how there will be no discrimination made on the basis of sex or religion, gender as well, which was added actually during the Ben-Gurion drafting process by him, it seems, and a variety of other very, very important ways of speaking about the rights of citizens. This had been in the Declaration of Independence from the Tzvi Berenstain draft, and indeed, even from the speech that was made after the Vad HaPoel HaTzioni had made its decisions. So this expressed just a deep consensus in the Yishuv, which had never been debated by anyone. Ben-Gurion, however, saw a little bit further than that. First, he understood that those rights had to be described as inherent rights, not just rights that the state would give to people, but rights that all people by themselves had. Second, the 2 points that Professor Rogachevsky raised about sovereignty, the natural right to be masters of our own fate in our own sovereign state, which is the English. The Hebrew is modestly different, but conveys the same idea. It doesn't include the strange phrase, masters of our own fate, so that's an idiosyncrasy of the English. But the Hebrew in some ways is even more stark. That was something that Ben-Gurion puts in at the last second. Same thing with that first paragraph that speaks about the genesis of the Jewish people in the land of Israel, and points to the significant aspect of that not being their history, not being that they were born there, and not getting some pointless argument about who was somewhere first. Right? He understands that's an intellectual dead end. And instead he focuses on the question of what are we doing here as we found this state? And in the debates, someone said that it would be impossible to found a Jewish state without mentioning our Book of Books. And that indeed is what he mentions. He says, that here they wrote Sefer HaSfarim, right? That's a phrase that comes up in the debates. It's not something he comes up with by himself, but it is a phrase that he puts there himself when he writes. And that's an extraordinary, extraordinary thing, because it leaves us with this very different vision of what the Declaration of Independence is in fact about. The earlier drafts were just about saying that the state would be in accordance with Resolution 181, and that it would give the citizens all this list of rights at the back, which were, we should add, in Resolution 181. Ben-Gurion goes further, and he actually makes important distinctions about where rights come from, about the state being a Jewish state, but doing so in a way that doesn't define it just for Jews or make it particularistic only for Jewish citizens, but rather says there's such thing as Jewish principles, that all the citizens who live in this state will be part of a state that's animated by those principles. And principles, not rules, not laws, principles. And he also makes this profound point about sovereignty, where sovereignty is something that the state's going to just have to assume, because the Jewish people, in the wake of the Holocaust, had learned the lessons of life without sovereignty. And so those are really the distillations of the Declaration of Independence that he wrote, and yet those 3 points, inherent rights, sovereignty, and principles, Jewish principles in a Jewish state, those are new things in the final text, which makes it this extraordinary story of Ben-Gurion's drafting and genius, uniquely, I think, in this whole story.
So, Neil, you were mentioning that the labor Zionists, they neglected Jewish religion, but Ben-Gurion and also Berl Katzenelson, A.D. Gordon, all of them were from labor Zionism. They were all people of the Bible. I mean, they had a really deep Jewish background and knowledge, but eventually a decision was made, and I'm asking about 2 words and 1 phrase that was added to the Declaration. The Declaration of Independence doesn't have the word democracy on one hand. It doesn't have God on the other hand. Instead, Ben-Gurion used Tzur Israel. How do you say it in English? Tzur Israel.
That's the best way to say it. I mean, the Rock of Israel is the
The
literal
Rock
one,
of
but it's a
Israel.
bad translation.
Why don't we see those, democracy on one hand and God on the other hand? And why was the decision to use Tzur Israel? Was there any finding about that?
Oh yeah. So yeah. So this is insofar as there'd been scholarship of the Declaration of Independence in recent years. Like shockingly, there'd been very little before we embarked on this project. Now it's like it's exploding. It's great to see. This was always the issue people talked about. Why isn't there democracy in the text? I think there's a bit of a red herring.
Especially now, by the way.
Because especially now, right? I mean, this keeps on coming up, right? Because if you look at it, in light of the distillation which Dov just presented, you can't read this text and assume that the state is not going to be governed in anything but a substantively democratic way, right? Because you have democracy, like other terms in political theory, you need to be quite specific about what you mean. What you mean on one hand could be simply procedural. We have elections and votes. Okay, the Yishuv had all again not debated because the Yishuv had governed itself democratically. There was no what other you're going to have a council of aristocrats governing the Jews in Palestine in 1948, many with just the shirts on their back. Possession, absurd, right? So it's going to procedurally democratic and then substantively democratic, a state of social and political rights, right? Equality under the law, all the things we think of when we think of a strong, admirable democracy in our time. So so I think it's the word democracy didn't have to be in there for this because it was clear and that was not debated either. It's actually the case, and this I actually didn't see until after the book was published. Ben-Gurion reflected in a diary entry a few months later. Someone asked him already in October 48, why wasn't it there? And he gave an answer which I think confirms what we say. He says, I wanted to express this in a Hebraic vernacular. Democracy is a concept from the Greeks, whereas we had the vision of the prophets, another phrase in the Declaration. We had, my invocation of Sefer Esfarim. This is a kind of Hebraic democracy, right? So whether that was on his mind at the time, I don't quite know, or whether this is mythologizing, but it expresses the same point. It didn't have to be there. This was going to be, a state which had expressed rights for all, and on one, Jewish, non-Jewish is simply a state, and also a state in which Jewish ideas would find some kind of comfortable home, and ways of life would be tolerated. And would be allowed to flourish. As for the name of God, I mean, that's another fascinating story through the genealogy of the Declaration. That had been the name of God from the beginning. The first draft, this had been chosen by the rabbi Harry Davidovitz and Mordechai Baham. They had translated from the American Declaration of Independence, that final, the phrase of, Thomas Jefferson and his colleagues, see the, under the blessing, seeking the blessings of divine providence. That's how they translated divine providence, right? And yes, there's this mythologizing, does it refer to God? Does it just refer to Zionist strength or whatever? But it was clear to all that, it's in the daily prayer, right? Sur Yisrael refers to God. So I think that's also kind of a non-issue. The religious question, what's most important, the religious question is in this first paragraph where he clearly says, the Jews created cultural treasures. What are those cultural treasures? They derive from the world of, the world, the ideas, the principles, the ethics of the Bible. And that says much more about, to me, the Jewish heritage than, what name do we choose for the name of God?
Yeah. And indeed, Ben-Gurion later in life developed this mythology around the phrase Tzur Yisrael, because he claimed, and it probably did indeed happen, that late at night, on the night before he wrote the Declaration of Independence, a rabbi and a far-left member of this Council of 13 who were on his drafting committee came to him, and indeed there probably was a drafting committee, and they probably did have some discussion, came to him to debate whether or not the name of God should appear in the Declaration of Independence. And he claims in these letters he wrote 20 years after the Declaration of Independence was done, and after all the vital participants in this process, including all those he alleged were part of this debate had passed away, that they came to him and debated the question of whether or not Tzur Yisrael should appear at the end of the text. Now, what is true for certain is that the debates of the protocols of the debate of Minhal Ta'am really do show some debate over this issue. It was actually the single thing that was most debated. And Ben-Gurion in this post hoc, in this later account that he offers, says that he came up with the ingenious compromise of Tzur Yisrael, which could be a rock or it could be a reference to God. But the fact of the matter is that it had been in the text very much from the beginning. Now, I can't resist the opportunity to say something about the democracy question, because the democracy question is such an important one today. And just to reinforce what Professor Rogachevsky said, the Declaration of Independence does include references to both elections that will happen and substantive democratic rights. Now, Ben-Gurion was a kind of student of the Greek classics at the time, believe it or not. He was a very avid reader of Plato and was known to fly around with a copy of Plato's Laws, actually. and so for him, the word democracy had this deep Greek meaning. It literally just means the majority are the strongest. And so he thought he was building a deeper state whose legitimacy would rest in the citizens and their rights. And of course, it's unimaginable that they would appoint leaders anyway other than voting. So I think that too much has been made of this absence of the word democracy from the text, when in fact the text is unquestionably substantively democratic, procedurally democratic, and the reason given by its principal author for not including that word later on seems to just be based on his philological preference for words that don't have Greek origins. So I think that's
something you share with Churchill, by the way. Also, Ben-Gurion also learned from Churchill. Famously said in 1940, "Whenever I can find a word that's not Latinate, which goes to the old Anglo-Saxon, I choose that." So Ben-Gurion was, in his own mind, following Churchill's footsteps.
So great minds will have very idiosyncratic opinions sometimes. So David Ben-Gurion, being the special person he was no different. But I think that on the substance of the matter, as Professor Rogachevsky says, while it's a much debated question, after you look at the source text, it's not even a question. It's just so clear that the meaning of this document veers in this very rich discourse of rights.
Thank you for this answer. I mean, I think that it sheds a lot of light on the Declaration of Independence, because people, especially today, are questioning why there was no democracy. I mean, from the right wing and from the left wing, they're saying there is also no God in Israel. So now we're going to move to today. And especially in the last, I would say, in the past 21st weeks, there were rallies in Israel protesting for democracy and against the political reform or political upheaval. It depends from which side of the spectrum you're coming. And if we look at the vision, if we look at the ideal, okay, of what the Declaration of Independence was aiming for, and, or as they say in Hebrew, there is a song of a band called Machina, איפה המדינה ואיפה החזון? Where is the state and where is the vision? Where do we stand with that today?
Sure. So, I mean, I think there's, like, our book sort of provides an interesting intellectual paradigm for thinking about this question, because we don't shy away from saying that the Declaration of Independence has three main themes. And those themes are in order: sovereignty, inherent rights, and a broadly and capaciously defined, not narrowly defined, not defined by its observances, a Jewish state. And so we make this case that it's Jewish principles, sovereignty, and inherent rights, and that those are the things that we would be asking ourselves if we were to ask the question, did we live up to the Declaration of Independence? But rather than answering that question directly, I'd actually want to phrase it a little bit differently, because I think that there are two tendencies in studying great old documents like this. One is to say, what was its original intent? What did the drafters mean? And then be really particularistic about whether or not we think that its original intent is being met, as though we're going through a checklist. And I think that there's something more here. I think rather than asking ourselves, have we lived up to the old founders' great principles today, we should ask ourselves instead, are these our principles? Right? Are these the principles that actually matter? Like, do the principles stand on their own two legs? And can we learn a lot about them and about ourselves today too, by thinking about these principles? And on that front, I just can't imagine three better ones to think about. Right? The question of sovereignty, like, have we actually carved out a state, and have we been willing to to understand all the compromises that come with that, but to understand the necessity of those compromises so that we can have a state? Because having a state's a messy thing. The Jewish people were the people of the book, as they say in the first paragraph of the Declaration of Independence, who were becoming a people with a state, as it says further down. And so I think that on that front, no one can say that the state hasn't done something remarkable in becoming, the first Jewish state since the era of Bar Kokhba, as Ben-Gurion tried to date it during the debates that happened amidst the Council of 13 that we narrate in our book. So on that front, sure thing. On the question of substantive rights and democratic rights, are those something that is broadly ingrained and deeply ingrained in the ethos of the state? It's impossible to imagine someone saying anything differently. I mean, people will and should always have debates about the scope of rights, the nature of rights, the genesis of rights. Indeed, the United States, the United Kingdom, and France, the countries that have, like, the deepest rights traditions. He used the phrase that's the phrase in political theory, right? The deepest rights traditions continue to have all these same debates themselves, and is very alive in Israel. I mean, that sort of debate always will be and has been and always will be alive in Israel, both in civil society and in the government, and in the way the government is composed, with a court and deep debate that the court will undertake all the time over some questions that aren't political but pertain to rights. So I think that too is something that is just so alive today. And then the final question: what is it to be a Jewish state? This mystery that Ben-Gurion tried to answer through this elliptical phrase about the Book of Books having been authored by the Jewish people in antiquity, and that having some meaning to us today, and being something that draws us together. For me, the inspiration I take from that is the idea that what makes the Jewish state a Jewish state isn't just blood and soil. It's not nationalism defined the same way that so many do. But rather, it's the Jewish people's ideas, because we're people drawn together by ideas from different ethnicities and locales, who somehow naturally and immediately have been able to live together in a state. The final thing I'd want to throw in is that all three of these principles are in the same declaration. Now, if we are deciding to be really argumentative and legalistic and lawyerly, we could point out all the contradictions that exist among these three principles. I mean, liberal rights and strong sovereignty, religious principles and universal ideals. All of these things, one can find areas where these three concentric circles, don't well overlap. But it doesn't mean that they can't all hang together, and it doesn't mean that we can't try to find some way to make them hang together. Because we must, because if we don't have a state, we can't guard our rights and we can't guard our people. And if we don't have some principles, who are we and what are we doing? And if those principles are just for us, what's the point? So I think that there's something, the same way that there are contradictions that one can find between these three big principles, it's also unimaginable to not be trying to pull them together. So that's my sort of drush on the subject for the moment. I'm sure, Neil, you got one too.
I'm just going to add one thing. Just observing sociologically, politically, the protest movement over recent months that you mentioned, it's been kind of heartening from the perspective of authors of a book on the Declaration of Independence. Because yes, it's been invoked by the protest movement. There have been ceremonial signings and the like. It's literally everywhere, more prominent than ever before in Israeli history. But it's not as if the proponents of the judicial reform have opposed the Declaration of Independence. It's not as if they've turned to the Israeli founding. Maybe you could find, you can always find one or two wackos. But in general, I mean, it's not been an assault on this also. And that teaches me, precisely for some of the reasons that were just articulated, that can be a kind of unifying document in this sense. Not a document in the sense of consensus. No, there are going to be different interpretations. How much should we have do we need to cut our, is the state trying to do too much? Is it, veer too far in trying to, dispense, social rights for all at the expense of political rights? There are going to be partisan divisions on this, healthy partisan divisions, as indeed there are in the United States. But as a frame for a general frame of principles around which you can say, okay, this is what we're doing here. This is our task, and a task that's not simply for us, but expresses some bigger vision of our project as a project. I think it can serve this unifying role. So I've been heartened to see it, and and I think interest in it is going to only increase in the years ahead, both from narrow Supreme Court front, but also in a political, social, cultural way as well.
So, before we conclude, I would like to ask you to share like a really fascinating fact that you found. I mean, there are a lot of findings that you had, but the thing that I would say not blew your mind the most, but the most astonishing thing that you found when you were researching, the Declaration of Independence.
I'm worried we'll have the same answer as frequently occurs. But just watching David Ben-Gurion operate at every level is astonishing, right? I mean, I'd come into this with admiration, from a labor Zionist background, from a little kid, as a person who'd been running around in my consciousness, but seeing him operate at the political level, bringing his colleagues along to his way of doing things, building consensus when he needs to, but also throwing the buck stops with him when he needed to. Also at that level, and also surprising also on the intellectual level, like acting. When I started, I had this view of very very good political judgment, but at the level of ideas, at the level of principles, he doesn't belong in the same conversation of the great statesmen of history that we learn about, right? The Alexander Hamiltons, the James Madison, and so on. My view of that evolved and changed as you just look at him grappling with these questions and what he's able to do at this moment at the level of ideas as a founder of a state. Yes, there are ways, the hater's going to hate, critic's going to criticize this or that, and I may agree with some criticisms here and there, but he was really the indispensable man for this, and both at the level of would you actually have had a sovereign state, and at the level of what lights will the state look up to as it goes along in its journey. He really did something that all Jews have to be grateful for, I think. So this was just, and I'm gonna hopefully the rest of my career I'm gonna spend more time with him and follow him along through the subsequent years in the state at the level of ideas as well. So yeah.
And so the one I'll throw out there, I'll go more meta since Neil took the best particular one, which is how much fun David Ben Gurion is. Although you could have made a case for Golda Meir being the funniest speaker throughout. I mean, there are all these moments where, and I'm digressing, I'm giving you two instead of one favorite thing. I'm really pulling a cheap one here. Golda Meir, in some of these debates, there are extremely long speeches by learned people. The Pinchas, the time Rosenbluth, later Rosen, the first justice ministers, this fairly long-winded lawyer in some of the debates, and Golda Meir will just cut him off and say, "We've got to go all the way," things like that. And so she's this extraordinary, character in the debates. But that's not what I wanted to say. What I wanted to say is that the richness of the founding debates of Israel is much deeper than I think is widely appreciated. The historian, and I'm not trying to make little of her extraordinary work, Anita Shapira, probably one of the authorities on Ben Gurion, on the founding period, an extraordinarily talented and vital historian in the legacy of Israel, always had this throwaway line about how you look at the founding debates of Minhel Ha'am, and there's not as much there as you'd like. And I see where she was coming from in the sense that they didn't debate the parts of the Declaration of Independence that many people care about so much. For example, the list of rights that it includes. But they're actually a very rich debate once you put them into the context of all the history that came before and would come after. And so if you're willing to take the time and the effort to mull through the decisions that were being made and to use this really rich new world of documents that's opened up in the last 10, 15 years to start to think about what the main ideas were and the open questions were during the founding period of Israel, that we think there's a lot that one can come away with. And this book is something that we hope others will be able to use to join us on that journey.
So I got to say, first thing, thank you very much for enlightening us today. For me, actually, two foundings about the Declaration of Independence that I found amusing were, first thing, that they literally signed on an empty, there was no declaration over there. They literally signed on an empty canvas.
It's a good story for kids also. There was not enough time for the matzah to be baked, for the bread to be baked.
That's a topic for a different conversation. The other thing that I found out that I was expecting, just like most Israelis, if you're not well educated, that Menachem Begin will be one of the people signing the Declaration of Independence. He was the leader of the Irgun at that time. And then I found out that he's not there. And when I went to question it, I realized that he was not a political leader at that time. He was actually a military leader. And everybody who signed, he was not a part of Moetzet Ha'am. So that was interesting for me. I really want to thank you for shedding light on this amazing document. I highly recommend reading both the declaration and your book because I think it sheds a lot of light on how Israel was envisioned, and it actually sets a clear path to how Israel should be looked like. So thank you very much for joining me today. Thank you, Professor
Kobi, it was a pleasure. Anytime.
And thank you.
It's an absolute pleasure.
And thank you, people who joined us. And one last thing, if you're joining us on Sunday, it's the Celebrate Israel Parade. If you don't have the details, reach out to me. And if you have the details, then I'll see you Sunday on 5th Avenue. Thank you very much.